In the quiet, sun-drenched streets of Santa Monica, California, stands a house with an eerie past, a home that once belonged to the legendary actor John Wayne. The sprawling estate, with its picturesque exterior and old-world charm, is now a place of whispered tales, where even the bravest cannot shake the sensation that something or someone lingers. John Wayne, a man whose tough guy persona defined Hollywood for decades, was known for his commanding presence both on-screen and off. His house, perched on a quiet hill, was his sanctuary, a retreat from the chaos of fame and the world. But it seems the peace of this house, now abandoned by its famous owner, has been disturbed. Over the years, reports have surfaced of strange occurrences, some so chilling that they could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. Local residents have claimed to hear the sound of heavy boots echoing through the house's hallways, even though no one is there. Others speak of an unmistakable presence that seems to watch them from the shadows. Visitors who venture close to the property at night often describe feeling an overwhelming sense of unease, like someone is just behind them, breathing down their neck. But when they turn, the air is thick with silence. One story in particular sends a shiver down the spine. A couple who had rented a nearby vacation home decided to take a stroll near the old Wayne estate. As they walked past the tall iron gates, they swore they saw the faint outline of a man standing in the window. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably familiar. They initially dismissed it as a trick of the light, but as they continued their walk, they felt a sudden chill in the air, and the unmistakable scent of tobacco smoke wafted past them. Later, after hearing about the house's ghostly reputation, they realized the figure they had seen resembled John Wayne himself, in his signature cowboy hat, standing motionless as if watching over his domain. The unsettling sensation they felt that night lingered for days. Nervous glances at the dark windows, the feeling of being watched, even in their own home. Many who have stayed in the area tell similar stories. The house may no longer be occupied, but it seems John Wayne's spirit never left. There are reports of lights flickering at odd hours, and furniture shifting as though the man himself is still roaming the halls. One former housekeeper recalled feeling a heavy presence in the master bedroom, a pressure that filled the room as though someone was standing just behind her, invisible but undeniably there. Though the house has since passed into other hands, its haunting remains. For those who dare to pass by, it's impossible to ignore the inexplicable sense that the Duke's ghost still roams the property, keeping a watchful eye over the land he once called home. Whether it's his love for the home or his unwillingness to leave the world he knew so well, the mystery of John Wayne's lingering presence continues to captivate and terrify those who encounter it. The stories of John Wayne's lingering presence only seem to grow with time, fueling the rumors that no one could truly escape the ghost of the Duke. Locals who dared venture near the house after dark would often speak in hushed tones, reluctant to share their encounters, but those brave enough to venture past the gates always seemed to return with the same eerie sensation, as if something or someone was walking just a step behind them. One summer evening, a young filmmaker, drawn by the legend of Wayne's ghost, decided to document the paranormal activity rumored to be present in the house. Armed with only a camera, a flashlight, and his skepticism, he made his way to the abandoned property under the cover of night. He had heard the stories, of course, but like most, he chalked them up to folklore until he stood on the edge of the estate, gazing up at the darkened windows of the old house. As he set up his camera equipment just outside the gates, the air grew colder. The soft, salty breeze from the Pacific seemed to vanish, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made his skin prickle. The silence felt suffocating, almost unnatural. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see anything, but there was nothing. Shaking off the unease, he pushed on, convinced that the stories were just that, stories. He crept closer, the hairs on the back of his neck rising as he passed under the high, iron gates that once stood as the threshold to a legend's home. As he approached the front door, the faintest sound echoed through the night, the unmistakable creak of heavy boots against the floorboards. Frozen, he turned his head slowly, half expecting to see the ghostly figure of the Duke standing there, as many others had described. But the shadows offered no clue. Instead, it was the sound of the boots that lingered, reverberating from inside the house. almost as though someone who had walked that path 1,000 times was pacing. The filmmaker, heart-pounding, decided to press on. The door was unlocked, an odd detail considering the house had been abandoned for years. His camera clicked on as he stepped inside, the lens capturing every dim corner of the grand foyer. The house smelled old dust and wood, but there was something else, too. A faint trace of something familiar, tobacco smoke. As he ventured deeper into the house, the temperature dropped noticeably. His breath came out in visible puffs, though it was a warm summer evening outside. The deeper he went, the stronger the sense of being watched grew, and with every step, the air seemed to tighten, like it was filled with unseen eyes. He moved cautiously through the living room, where a large portrait of John Wayne once hung. The painting had been taken down long ago, but the imprint of its frame still remained on the wall. He found himself drawn to it, standing in the exact spot where Wayne's eyes had once watched over his home. Then, in the silence, a faint sound came to him from upstairs, a creak, the unmistakable groan of floorboards under the weight of something heavy. He was no longer alone. Compelled by a mixture of dread and fascination, he made his way up the staircase, each step echoing louder than the last. As he reached the top, the hallway stretched out before him, dark and quiet, the shadows pressing in from both sides. It was then that he saw it, a figure at the end of the hallway, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing motionless in the shadows. The filmmaker's heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. But it was there, clear as day, though barely illuminated by the moonlight seeping through the window. He raised his camera, his hands shaking, unsure if he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. Through the lens, the figure came into focus, its outline unmistakable. It was a man in a cowboy hat, his silhouette large and imposing, his stance resolute and unyielding. For a long moment, he dared not move, afraid that if he blinked, the figure would vanish into thin air. But then, with an abruptness that made his blood run cold, the figure turned its head slowly, deliberately, and locked eyes with him. The room went still. Not a single sound could be heard, not even the soft rustling of leaves outside. The filmmaker's breath caught in his throat. The figure did not speak, but the sense of its presence was overwhelming, like it was reaching deep into his very soul. The air around him grew suffocating, and the weight of the silence seemed to press down on him, threatening to crush him. Without thinking, he bolted down the hallway, his footsteps pounding against the wood. The image of the silent figure burned into his mind. As he reached the staircase, something strange happened. The lights in the house flickered once, twice before they went out completely, plunging him into darkness. The flashlight in his hand flickered and died, leaving him in an oppressive, suffocating void. With nothing left but instinct, he rushed down the stairs, nearly tripping over the worn steps in his haste to escape. As he reached the front door, he could hear it again, the unmistakable sound of boots following him, coming closer, faster. He didn't dare look back. He tore through the door and onto the front porch, the cool night air hitting his face like a rush of water. Only when he was safely outside, with the door slammed shut behind him, did he dare to glance back at the house. The windows remained dark, silent. There was no sign of the figure, no indication that anything had ever been there. But the sensation of being watched didn't leave him. As he stood in the yard, gasping for breath, he realized that the house was still alive with something or someone that didn't belong to the world of the living. John Wayne's spirit, it seemed, had not yet finished his final act. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The filmmaker stood frozen on the porch, the chill of the night air pressing against his skin as the weight of what had just happened settled over him. His heart raced in his chest, the sound of his pulse ringing in his ears. He tried to convince himself that it was just an illusion, a trick of the mind, but deep down he knew something was wrong. Something that went beyond the ordinary, beyond what the human eye should be able to comprehend. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the dark silhouette of the house behind him, but instead, something far more unsettling caught his eye. There, in the corner of the yard, near the large oak tree that had stood for decades, he saw a faint glow, dim but unmistakable. The glow seemed to pulsate in the darkness, as if it were breathing, flickering with life like a candle in a dead wind. A wave of terror washed over him, and against every instinct that told him to run, he found himself drawn to it. The glow shifted as if beckoning him, and despite the fear gnawing at his gut, his feet moved of their own accord, each step heavier than the last. As he approached the tree, the faint glow sharpened into a clearer shape, an old, weathered rocking chair, slowly creaking back and forth, though there was no wind. The filmmaker's breath caught in his throat. He had seen this chair before in old photographs of the house. It had once sat on the porch, a relic from a bygone era. But now it was here, in the yard, as though it had always belonged to this spot. The chair rocked again, the rhythmic motion almost hypnotic. And then, without warning, a low, gravelly voice broke the silence. Not many come back from the house at night, the voice muttered, barely above a whisper, but the words seemed to vibrate in the air around him, deep in his bones. The filmmaker's eyes darted around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one in sight. Only the chair continued to rock, moving in eerie synchrony with the voice's cadence. Some things should never be disturbed, the voice continued, its tone filled with a dark, mournful wisdom. John Wayne doesn't like it when strangers trespass. The filmmaker stumbled backward, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his camera. He had to get it on film. He had to prove to himself, prove to the world that he wasn't imagining this. But when he reached for the camera, it was gone. The camera, the one he had held in his hands just moments ago, had vanished into thin air. He was alone, or so it seemed. Suddenly, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, as if the very earth was alive with unseen forces. The filmmaker's feet sank into the soil, and a deep rumbling sound began to emanate from the ground. He tried to pull his feet free, but it was as though the earth itself had swallowed him, pulling him deeper into its grip. Panicking, he reached out toward the tree, grasping for anything to hold on to, but his fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, something that didn't belong to the natural world. He turned his head, eyes wide with terror, and saw it. A figure emerging from the darkness, its face obscured by shadows, but its presence undeniable. The figure was tall, its body towering over him. And then, as if the shadows parted just enough for him to see clearly, he recognized the unmistakable outline. It was the same figure he had seen in the hallway earlier, the one that had stared at him with those piercing eyes. But now it was closer, so close he could feel the heat of its breath on his skin, though he could not see its mouth. The filmmaker's heart skipped a beat. There was no mistaking it now. The figure was John Wayne, or something that wore his shape, a hollow semblance of the man who had once commanded the silver screen. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, glowing faintly, like dying embers in the dark. And then, in a voice that sent ice through the filmmaker's veins, Wayne spoke again. "You think you're the first to come looking for answers?" His voice was low, threatening, and yet there was something hauntingly familiar in its gravelly timbre. "I've been waiting for someone like you." The filmmaker's breath hitched as the earth continued to pull at him, and with every passing second, it felt as if the ground was closing in on him. He could feel the pressure rising, a force that threatened to crush him under its weight. Desperately, he tried to scream, to run, but his body betrayed him, unable to move. John Wayne's ghost loomed above him, as if tethered to the land itself, bound by something more ancient than the house or the man who had once lived there. It was as if the very soul of the land, the very foundation of this place, was connected to the spirit of the Duke, and it refused to let go. "You won't leave until I let you?" Wayne's voice rumbled, the words slipping into the filmmaker's mind like poison. "And I don't let anyone go." The filmmaker's vision blurred, and he felt his body trembling uncontrollably, his senses failing him. He tried to fight it, to break free, but there was no escaping the grip of the past. The air grew thick with something intangible, something dark and suffocating, as if the very house, the very earth, was alive and feeding off his fear. And then, as quickly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The ground released its grip, and the pressure lifted. The filmmaker gasped for air, falling to his knees as the world around him fell silent once more. The rocking chair had stopped moving. The glow had faded, and the figure of John Wayne, the ghost that haunted the property, was gone. But the filmmaker knew deep down that he had not escaped. He had merely been released for a time, left with a warning. As he stumbled to his feet, his mind racing, the full realization hit him. There was something more to this house, to this land, than just the ghost of a man. Something ancient, something powerful, something that had never truly left. And it was waiting for the next person to dare to enter its domain. The filmmaker stood frozen on the sidewalk, his legs shaky, his mind still reeling from the inexplicable events he had just witnessed. The air around him felt thick, like something was pressing in from all sides, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, to run as fast as he could and never look back. But as he turned his gaze toward the house, something held him in place, a sense of compulsion stronger than his fear. The house stood there, silent and still, the faintest glimmer of moonlight illuminating its weathered facade. It was almost as if it was waiting for him to make a decision. The shadowed windows seemed to pulse with an unseen life, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement in the upper floors, just a flicker, a glimpse of something tall and broad-shouldered standing by the window. But when he blinked, it was gone. His throat tightened. He knew that he should keep walking, get in his car, and drive as far away from this place as he could. But something nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't shake, a need to understand. What had he really seen? Was it just the weight of the stories, the haunting tales passed down through the years? Or was there something more, something ancient and powerful living in that house, tied to the land, to the very soul of John Wayne? He turned back toward the gates, his mind in turmoil, but as his hand reached for the iron bars, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. It was a low, guttural hum, an almost imperceptible vibration, like the earth itself was alive. He felt it in his chest, a pressure building in the air, a subtle yet undeniable pull. Before he could react, the gates creaked open on their own, as if they had been waiting for him to cross their threshold. The filmmaker's heart raced, the fear threatening to overwhelm him, but his curiosity pushed him forward, pulling him back toward the house, deeper into the mystery that had ensnared him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt an overwhelming compulsion to go inside, to find out the truth. He crossed the yard again, his footsteps lighter now, almost tentative, but the house seemed to loom larger with every step. The glow from the rocking chair had faded, but as he neared the front door, he heard it again, a soft creak, a groan of old wood, as if the house itself was shifting, settling into its dark past. He hesitated. Should he go in? Should he just leave and forget about all of this? The stories, the ghostly sightings, the figure of John Wayne himself, it was all becoming too much to process. But the pull was too strong. He pushed open the door, which creaked loudly in protest, and stepped into the foyer once again. This time, the air felt heavier, suffused with an almost palpable presence. The house wasn't empty, not entirely. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and in the corner of his eye, he swore he saw something move, a fleeting glimpse of a tall figure, its silhouette almost familiar. The filmmaker walked deeper into the house, each step slow, deliberate. He could feel the temperature drop, the coolness seeping into his skin, and he shivered involuntarily. The air was thick with the scent of old tobacco, and though the house was silent, he could feel the faintest hum, like a vibration in the walls, an undercurrent of something far beyond the ordinary. The hall stretched out before him, and with each passing second, the house seemed to grow larger, more imposing, as if it was alive, breathing, watching. The floor beneath him creaked and groaned, and a distant sound echoed from upstairs, the unmistakable sound of boots against wood. It was then that he heard the voice again, low and gravelly, coming from somewhere deep within the house. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, the words dragging through the air like a chain, a weight that pressed against him. No one ever leaves. His heart skipped a beat. He spun around, half expecting to see the figure of John Wayne standing just behind him. But there was nothing but the empty house, the long, silent hallways stretching into darkness. "Leave now and I'll let you go," the voice murmured again, but this time it came from closer, just behind him. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. A chill swept through him, and the house seemed to close in, the walls shifting, narrowing, pressing inward. His breath came in short gasps, panic rising in his chest. But he couldn't leave, not yet. He had to know. He turned back toward the staircase, its dark wooden steps leading up into the unknown. The sound of boots was louder now, as though someone was descending the stairs. Slowly, methodically, as he ascended the staircase, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive with history, that it had absorbed every moment, every conversation, every breath of the man who had once lived here. The walls seemed to whisper with the echoes of the past, and with every step, the air grew thicker, more oppressive. At the top of the stairs, he turned the corner into the long hallway. The figure was there again, standing at the far end of the hall, just out of sight, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a cowboy hat and long coat, just like John Wayne had been in his prime. But this time there was something different about him. The figure was no longer just a ghost, no longer just an image, a shadow. It was John Wayne, but not the man who had once graced the silver screen. This was a version of him warped by time, by something darker, something that had twisted his spirit into something ancient and vengeful. The filmmaker's body froze as the figure turned toward him, and for the first time, the ghostly presence spoke not in the deep, gravelly voice of Wayne, but in something far more chilling, something otherworldly. "You should have stayed away," it whispered. "But now that you've come, you'll never leave." The filmmaker's breath caught in his throat. He tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figure began to advance, its slow, deliberate steps echoing in the silence. The ground seemed to tremble beneath him, and the walls of the house seemed to shift, as if the house itself was closing in on him, its very structure alive with a dark energy. He backed away, his mind racing, but there was no escape. The figure was coming closer, its presence filling the hallway, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The house seemed to pulse with the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, each step a heartbeat, each step drawing the filmmaker deeper into its grip. And then, as the figure reached out for him, something happened. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening around him. He felt the floor give way beneath him, and with a sudden, dizzying sensation, he was falling into the house, into the past, into the very heart of the dark legacy that had been left behind. In that moment, the filmmaker understood. He had become a part of the house now, just like all the others before him. Trapped in the endless loop of its haunted history, a ghost among ghosts, waiting for the next soul to cross the threshold. And from somewhere deep within the house, the voice of John Wayne whispered one last time, "Welcome home. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental."